The U.S. may be involved in 2 hot wars and one shaping up in the South China Sea, but that doesn't mean they aren't playing around elsewhere. Today we take a look at 2 cases here in the Western Hemisphere, the case of Guyana and the case of Honduras. And for that, we speak with our 2 resident experts in Latin America and the Caribbean, Stephen Sefton, reporting from Nicaragua, and Camila Escalante, who is on assignment today in Toronto. Let's start with you, Stephen. Let's start with the situation in Essequibo.
Okay, so Don, and this is yet one more example of the endless examples of U.S. intervention in the region, and not just U.S. intervention, like so many other things in the world. It's a legacy of the imperialism of Western powers, the European powers, and their relations through the 19th century with the developing power of the United States. And so you have this territory in the eastern part of Venezuela, the southeastern part of Venezuela, bordering on Guyana. If you look at it on maps, it's often represented as being part of Guyana. But in fact, it's been a disputed territory since the second half of the 19th century. And as usual, there was an agreement, kind of an arbitration back in the 19th century in favor of essentially the imperial power, Britain, which was the colonial power in Guyana. And the Venezuelan government at the time was too weak to fight its corner effectively. So the British got their way and effectively appropriated or misappropriated the territory in question, Essequibo, which is extremely rich, as people have found over the last few decades, in hydrocarbons, especially oil. But I think there's gases there as well. So in 1966, when Guyana became independent, the then government of Venezuela managed to effectively establish itself as a party to an agreement between Guyana, the United Kingdom, and Venezuela itself, in which it was agreed that there would be a process of dialogue and negotiation between Guyana, the newly independent country, and Venezuela over to establish their respective rights over this territory of Essequibo. And then that process was carried forward under the governments of Comandante Eterno Hugo Chavez. And from 1913 onwards, the period of acute destabilization initiated by the United States, attempting to destroy Venezuela and its government. Essequibo and Guyana's role in Essequibo became a tool for U.S. intervention. And so what we're seeing now is that extraordinary wealth of the Exxon Corporation and other related big oil companies are working effectively. They've colonized the Guyanan government, and they're trying to push through or create a situation in which, with the military support of their government, the United States, they impose their control over the hydrocarbon resources of Essequibo. And so this is a very important moment in the history of that part of Latin America. After looking at the way the United States has behaved in Ukraine and Gaza, one has to wonder if they're not actually pushing for some kind of military activity in Latin America, because they failed by other means to overthrow the legitimate government of Venezuela. And you can see this happening elsewhere and throughout the region. And in particular, it may be interesting to look at the situation in Honduras.
Yeah, before we go there, just the situation between Venezuela and Guyana, just to put it in context, the population of Guyana is less than 1 million. It's around just shy of 800,000, okay? And the population of Venezuela is in excess of 30 million. So, and this rich Venezuela's claim dates back to Bolivar. Bolivar was warning first the Dutch and then the British, against trying to move into Essequibo.
Yeah, in its independence, the territory was part of Venezuela, and then from about 1840 onwards,
that's right.
The British and the United States governments negotiated between themselves, completely excluding Venezuela, and in classic imperialist style, imposed British control. The same thing happened in Nicaragua at around the same time in the 19th century. It was an agreement between Britain and the United States over rights to the Nicaraguan Canal. In this case, it's over the rights to the Essequibo hydrocarbons.
That's right. All right, so let's go with Camila to look at what's happening in, the related thing that's happening in Honduras. In other words, another form of the way U.S. tries to get control.
Yeah, well, one of the things that connects the example of the Essequibo in Guyana and Honduras is that the United States is trying to exert control in these countries through its embassies, through different forms of intervening, largely led or, with the face of the U.S. ambassadors there, but also, with a lot of intervention that's coming from Southcom, because these areas, Guyana and Honduras, continue to have very high U.S. military presence, and they're using all of their resources and capacity to actually try to boost U.S. interest in those regions and actually try to connect U.S. businesses and corporations with the different what they call stakeholders in those countries. In the example of Honduras, there's outrage because last week the U.S. ambassador in Tegucigalpa made a series of interventionist statements. She was summoned by the foreign minister, Enrique Reina, and they had to have a little talk because, of course, the Honduran government said the statements that you've been making regarding our internal matters, the Congress, and the selection of a new attorney general is a matter having to do with Honduras. It has nothing to do with the United States. The ambassador and officials of the State Department shouldn't be making such comments. What happened was that the ambassador, she actually held what looked like a press scrum. She was standing in the middle, and the video is available online, standing in the middle of all this Honduran press, and she was making comments about the decisions being made by the Honduran Congress. She was questioning them, making all sorts of judgments, and saying that the United States government doesn't see this as a good way of handling the election of the attorney general, and that's simply not how an ambassador should act inside of a country. Normally, official statements, if they're to be made at all, should be made through the regular diplomatic channels. That is, internally, they should be done officially on letterhead through the State Department or from the embassy itself. But she's standing in the middle of a bunch of reporters as if she's some sort of Honduran politician herself. That in of itself is very odd. So there's a lot of internal commotion that's going on in Honduras. Obviously, the government has come under attack by the opposition, but what the U.S. role in all of this has been very odd just on the optics alone. And it's very great to see that the Honduran government is immediately calling them out on them in the most official way and telling the U.S. that it will not accept this form of intervention.
That's just a common theme. They shake off. Look at Ecuador as one example, Brazil on and off, another example, Argentina, another example, even Chile going back to 1973, another example. The people finally get the boot of Uncle Sam off their neck, and all they do here is scheme and weave this web to regain power, and they're successful very often.
Yeah, it's worth pointing out that Laura Dogu, the current ambassador in Tegucigalpa in Honduras, is the person who was the local agent of the U.S. attempt to overthrow the government in Nicaragua, and she was the ambassador here in the years prior to 2018.
Just wondering when Victoria Nuland's going to show up. All right, thank you, guys. We're going to definitely track these two cases and continue to discuss what goes on here next week. Thanks for your time.
Thank you, Don.
Thanks a million, Don.
Thank you. For KPFK, I'm Don DeBar.